Now for the page 2 of the salt mind map, we'll be looking at how do we prepare salt. Now in order to know the steps to prepare salt, you must be very clear about the solubility of the salt first. So without memorizing the solubility table, without memorizing this table, you cannot do this salt preparation. Okay, because the first step for salt preparation is usually the question will ask you to prepare for example zinc sulfate, for example, and the first thing that you need to know is whether zinc sulfate is soluble or not. Okay, so for example, in order to prepare insoluble salt, this is the method, precipitation method, or we call it method 3, precipitation method. So for preparing soluble salt, we can either have this titration method or acid plus insoluble substance method. Okay, now let's look at preparing insoluble salt. Now an example here would be to prepare lead-2 sulfate. So from the solubility table, you know that lead-2 sulfate is not soluble. So in order to prepare lead-2 sulfate, you need to have 2 aqueous salt solutions. Okay, you need to have 2 soluble salt solutions. Okay, lead-2 sulfate. So the first salt solution would be lead-2 something. So there will be lead-2 nitrate, because lead-2 nitrate is soluble. And then the second solution would be something sulfate, and it must be soluble. So sodium sulfate. Okay, so sodium sulfate and lead-2 nitrate in order to prepare lead-2 sulfate. So the steps are very simple for precipitation method. The step would be to add sodium sulfate to lead-2 nitrate in a beaker in excess until no more precipitate is formed. Because when these two chemicals are mixed together, this is what you get. When Na2SO4, sodium sulfate, is mixed with lead-2 sulfate, is mixed with lead-2 nitrate, what you get is sodium nitrate as well as lead-2 sulfate. Okay, sodium nitrate and lead-2 sulfate. Now of course this is not balanced, but we do not need to balance this chemical equation because it's just for our reference. So this is an aqueous solution, this is soluble, this is insoluble. This is what we want to prepare from this question here. So we want to prepare lead-2 sulfate. This is the one, lead-2 sulfate. So when you add these two reactants, you see a precipitate of lead-2 sulfate is being formed. So you have to add this in excess to this until no more precipitate is formed. That is why the first step here, add sodium sulfate to lead-2 nitrate in a beaker in excess until no more precipitate is formed. Okay, then after that, you see the precipitate, then you need to filter to collect the precipitate, and the precipitate is actually your lead-2 sulfate. Wash the precipitate with distilled water to remove any impurities, and then dry the precipitate with filter paper. So this is actually all the steps which you need to write when the question asks you to when the question asks you how to prepare lead-2 sulfate. Alright, so this is the precipitation method. Just a recap, you need to know first thing is this lead-2 sulfate is insoluble. So when it is insoluble, we have to use precipitation method. And in order to use precipitation method to prepare an insoluble salt, the 2 starting materials must be soluble. That's why mixture of 2 aqueous salt solutions. So you have to figure out what are the 2 starting materials. From the name here, lead-2 sulfate, you know that the first starting material must be lead-2 something, and you have to make sure that it is soluble. The second starting material must be something sulfate, and you have to make sure that it is soluble. Then after that, you have to add the reactants in excess to each other until no more precipitate is formed. Then after that, just follow the steps here. Alright. Now, the difficult part for salt preparation is basically to prepare soluble salts. Okay. Now, in order to prepare soluble salts, There are two methods. For the first method, the starting materials are soluble, so this one you have to use titration method. Okay, for this method I'm not going to elaborate here. Now the second method basically is when the starting material are insoluble. Okay, acid plus insoluble substance. An example here would be to prepare zinc sulfate. Now in order to prepare zinc sulfate, the starting material, one of them must be a acid. So of course something sulfate, so you straight away you should think that it is sulfuric acid, something sulfate. Alright, and then the second one is excess metal, zinc. So these are the steps here. You have to add the zinc to sulfuric acid in a beaker until no more zinc dissolve or no more effervescence is observed. Now what is this effervescence here? Because when a metal, when you add it to an acid, you get a salt, zinc sulfate, and then you get hydrogen. So, and it is because of this hydrogen, because hydrogen is being released, you can see the effervescence. So you have to add zinc in excess to sulfuric acid. Why? Because we want to make sure that the product that we get later, there is no sulfuric acid, so we have to make sure that all the sulfuric acid has reacted. Okay, that's why you have to add zinc to sulfuric acid in a beaker until no more zinc dissolve. That means in excess, or no more effervescence is observed. Then after that we have to filter to remove excess zinc, because we add too much zinc already. Why do we add too much zinc? Because we want to make sure that all the sulfuric acid has reacted. Why? Because we do not want any sulfuric acid to be present in our product later. Okay, filter to remove excess zinc, collect the filtrate. Now the filtrate would be the zinc sulfate. Okay, then the heat the solution to saturation. Okay, when we collect the filtrate here, the filtrate basically has a lot of water inside, so we have to heat the solution to saturation, and then we let the solution to cool and crystallize. How do you test for saturation? Basically you just dip a glass rod in the solution, and then there will be crystal formed in the glass rod if the solution is saturated. Alright, let the solution to cool and crystallize. We filter to collect the crystals, wash the crystal with distilled water, and dry the crystals with filter paper. So all these are the standard steps. Alright, so this is basically to prepare a soluble salt using acid plus insoluble substance method. For the titration method, you can refer to the video to to find out the steps. Now for this method, for this acid plus insoluble substance method, you have to take note that it is not suitable for very reactive metals such as sodium, potassium and calcium. So these three metals we cannot add it to the acid. Why? Because these three metals are very reactive. When we add it to the acid, there might be explosions because they react violently with the acid. So remember, for potassium, sodium and calcium, we cannot add them to the acid. And unreactive metals such as copper, silver, also we cannot add them to the acid because there wouldn't be any reaction with the acid. So these five metals, we can't add them to the acid. One is because, for these three is because of safety issue, and for these two is because of non-reaction. Okay, this is basically about the salt preparation. And then the last page of the salt Mindmap is on the cation and anion identification. Okay, one thing to take note is that to test for the presence of water, we can either use one of these two chemicals. We can use anhydrous copper 2 sulfate, which is dry. Anhydrous means dry copper 2 sulfate, and it is actually in powder form. It is white, and when there is water present, it will change from white to blue. Alright, and also alternatively, we can test the presence of water using cobalt 2 chloride paper, and the dry cobalt 2 chloride paper is actually blue, and it would change from blue to pink if the substance that you're testing is water. So white to blue, blue to pink. Okay, so this table is very, very important, and it would tell you how do you test for a certain cation. So for example, in order to test for calcium, once I add the solution, let's say you have an unknown solution. You want to find out whether this unknown solution has calcium ion inside. So what you do is you add it to sodium hydroxide. You add sodium hydroxide to the solution, and then if there is white precipitate, it means that one of these 4 ions must be present, and in order to confirm, you have to add excess sodium hydroxide. Once you add excess sodium hydroxide, and still if the white precipitate is not soluble, doesn't dissolve, then that means calcium ion is present. Okay, so these are the common reagents, sodium hydroxide as well as aqueous ammonia. These are the common reagents used to test for cations. And so this table is extremely important again. This table here. This table is the explanation part. So when you try to memorize, you basically look at this table and memorize it. Okay, so this part is the testing for cation. Cation stands for positive ion. Now this is the testing for anions or negative ions. Okay, and over here is the testing for gases. So all this is really for your memorizing. There are a lot of things to memorize in a salt chapter, but just have to try your best to do it. Okay, after you have memorized it, you should do some TYS questions in order to find out whether you know how to apply what you have memorized or not.